everyone. I'm Karen Potts, and I have a very special guest with me here today, and this is Vinton Cerf. Some of you may recognize him. He's the vice president at Google and is known as the Chief Internet Evangelist at Google. And there's a little bit of a story how that came about. But for many of you who use the internet every single day, you may not have really thought about how did the internet start. And it started with Vint and his colleague Bob. And he's going to talk about that and share the story. But what many of you may not know is that Vint grew up hard of hearing. So not only is he known as the father of the internet, he happens to be hard of hearing. So then take us back to those early days when you were identified hard of hearing. What was that journey like?
Well, my recollection is that the first indications were back when I was about 10 years old. I would have been in fourth grade or something like that, or maybe fifth grade. So it must have been I must have been more like 9. I'm sure it was fourth grade or earlier. People noticed, the teachers noticed that I would miss things. I wasn't attentive. And they thought when they tested me, they decided I had some hearing loss and they were going to send me off to lip reading school or sign language school or something. And then the conclusion was I should just listen more. And so I was left in the mainstream, sat in the front row. And eventually it was pretty clear I was missing a lot because I could hear the teacher or at least follow what the teacher was saying. But if somebody asked the question in the back of the room and the teacher said yes, I didn't know what the yes answer was. I didn't know the question to which the yes answer was delivered. So when I was 13, which would have been in 8th grade, I started wearing hearing aids. And that did make a big difference. My hearing loss at that point was probably on the order of 25 decibels, which is pretty mild. Now, of course, it's more like 75 decibels, but then that's 60 years later. So not surprisingly, this is a progressive nerve loss, which it is now thought was a result of my having been born 6 weeks prematurely. This would have been in 1943. And at that point, they put you in an oxygen tent in order because your lungs, very small. But the reason that you're in an oxygen tent is because your lungs are not mature enough to get enough oxygen out of the atmosphere. So they think that the pure oxygen may have started this progressive neural loss. The good news is that the hearing aids get better at about the same rate my hearing gets worse. And so I've managed to function in a normal hearing world for the most part.
So as your hearing has gone down, the hearing aids have gotten better.
Hearing aids get better, right?
Okay. So those early days, like in high school and in college, was it challenging for you?
Well, actually, at age 13 is a terrible age to start wearing hearing aids. These are behind the ear aids. And I was discovering girls, and it turns out that when you're making out, your hearing aids squeal. And, so this is really disconcerting because you don't want to take them off because then you can't hear the other person. But if you leave them on, it's squealing. And so that was sort of an awkward time in my life. I've become, first of all, the hearing aids don't squeal as much now. I've got in-the-ear aids. And second, at some point, I got very comfortable telling people, I wear hearing aids and they do these funny things. You just get much more comfortable telling people, what you need, like, please make sure you have my attention before you start talking, things like that.
Where do you think that confidence comes from, getting comfortable with hearing aids and with hearing loss? Where does that confidence come from?
Well, at some point, you have to recognize that people won't know what to do to make things work better for you unless you tell them. And they might not even ask either because they didn't notice that there was a problem, or they were afraid to ask. And then some people are afraid to ask people with disabilities, what can I do to make, to help you function better? And so there are a lot of people, for example, who might be afraid to ask a blind person, do you cook? I had this conversation with a very good friend of mine who happens to be blind. And I didn't have the conversation until, we were both comfortable talking about disabilities. And so I said, do you cook? And he said, yes. And I said, well, how do you know when things are done? He said, put my finger on them. And I said, okay, so I'm not eating anything that you cook. Uh, and the fact that we could joke about this was an important element in our relationship. We could make fun of each other's disabilities. And that's coming quite a long way in terms of comfort level when you can actually make a joke about your friend's disability and everybody laughs.
I can kind of relate to that because when I was growing up, I didn't get my first hearing aid until I was 9, but I hid it. I mean, I would never show anybody my hearing aid, back then. And that squealing was really bad. It was really bad. So for me, I was very embarrassed growing up. And I developed what I call duck syndrome. In other words, everybody thought that I was functioning just fine. But underneath, I was paddling furiously, just trying to fit in, trying to make sure I heard everything and could follow everything. You're nodding your head, so I'm guessing you agree you experienced duck syndrome too. Do
Actually, I would argue that my wife's challenges were much more difficult than mine. She was born with normal hearing, but lost it all when she was 3. So she was essentially 95 dB down in one ear and 105 dB down in the other. She was wearing a big body aid, but it squealed and it only gave her some low frequency sound. So she ended up learning to lip read and spent 50 years, went through all of her school years in ordinary classrooms, no special help, went to college, raised a family, all in a world of silence until she got a cochlear implant in 1996. Suddenly the world opens up again, and now she has 2 cochlear implants and has adapted to that technology and is aggressively using it in every possible way imaginable. So her story is much more interesting than mine when it comes to overcoming disability.
that have to interview her? Yes. You also have 2 wonderful boys. I follow your son who's into photography and filmmaking. Amazing, absolutely amazing. So, well, when you got to college, what was that like for you? Because that was long before the ABA and access and technology.
Well, that's true. I started my undergraduate years in 1961 at Stanford University. And I was in mathematics. And, it turns out that the math has a very limited vocabulary. It's mostly, symbolic manipulation. And so you didn't really have to know very much. You had to know the math. But in terms of hearing the English, it wasn't as challenging as it might be for some other disciplines. And of course, you can learn a lot from both working the problems and reading the book. I had really good professors at Stanford. Their lectures were extraordinarily clear and understandable. One of them was so good I didn't take notes because all I needed to do was to remember, the diagrams that he drew. And when it came to taking the tests, I could derive most of the formulas from ground zero because his teaching was so good. So in my undergraduate years at Stanford were not terribly affected, I think, and by that time I'm wearing very good quality hearing aids and I'm able to function pretty much normally as long as I paid attention to good lighting where I could see people's faces and trying to make sure that if I was in a meeting, I was in a room that was relatively quiet or sit with a wall behind me in the restaurant to minimize the amount of background noise coming from behind me. Those are just tricks that you learn and they become almost unconscious after a while. The other thing, which was pretty amazing, is after I finished my undergraduate years, I went to work for IBM, and most of my responsibilities were running a computer system, writing code and things like that didn't require too much interaction, except for the occasional conference call, which I did find pretty challenging. And then I went to UCLA for graduate work. And at UCLA, the ARPANET project, the predecessor to the internet, gets started. And one of the first things that got invented is electronic mail. And so what a boon for people with hearing problems, because instead of having phone calls, you just send email back and forth. And now you got the clarity of the text instead of struggling to figure out what was it that somebody said on the phone. So really, early on in my career, email turned out to be really important technology that improved my ability to stay in sync with my colleagues.
I'm sure that definitely was a big advantage for you because now you could just rely on the written text. And it's funny
That,
because that's what we all do now. We rely on email. Everybody texts now. Almost nobody picks up the phone. They text first. So it's funny that you played a part in that. And having hearing loss, it was actually a gain for both you and the world. So I always tell people that, um, things that benefit us also benefit people with normal hearing. So that was it. So in those early days, you developed the TCP/IP protocol so that one computer, one system could communicate with another. And that was back in what, 1973, long before what we know as the World Wide Web, which was almost like 10 years later that we started. I remember the big mainframe computer in high school. There was an entire room with just one computer.
Actually, the World Wide Web doesn't get started till 1991, and it doesn't very visible at all until the Mosaic browser comes along, which is 1993. So it's 20 years into the internet development. It was and the internet was preceded by ARPANET at UCLA and SRI International and the University of Utah and University of Santa Barbara and the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency. So we have a 4-node network starting in 1969. And it solved a whole lot of the interoperability problems among different kinds of computers and operating systems. The Internet Project expanded on that to allow for many, many different networks to be able to interconnect. But throughout that whole story, starting in 1971, electronic mail is our primary means of communication and coordination. And that was really helpful. It overcame the time zone problems in addition to overcoming my problems with hearing and conference calls. So if there's any constant in my career, it's been I go to work in places where email is the norm for most communication, and that's very helpful.
Yeah, that's amazing. I mean, you're definitely a part of history. And I do know, like, when my husband came home with the first computer, and it was $3,000, and we had, 3 little babies. I'm like, what are we going to do with this contraption? I said to him, the next thing I know, I'm working for AOL for free internet. And so the internet opened everything for me, my writing career and just ways of communicating with people so easily. So it's been an amazing thing. Let's switch a little bit. And as you know, I wrote a book called Unwrapping Your Passion. So passion is a big word for me. So when you think of that word passion, you obviously have a passion for what you do. You're still working today, many, many years later after developing and sending the first email, you're still working. So you obviously have a passion for what you do. You've won many awards for your work. So when you think of that word passion, what does it mean to you and how do you define it?
Well, first of all, I didn't send the first email. Somebody else did that. But I certainly made heavy use of it when it was first introduced. Um, the real answer on passion, I think, has to do with engineering. In my case, I am an engineer who loves to solve problems. And that's true of most engineers. I mean, just give me a problem to solve. The satisfaction of figuring out the answer and figuring out a solution is really what drives me. Then I'm willing to spend a lot of time trying to find answers. So sometimes it may be years and even decades. So the internet program starts with its ARPANET predecessor in 1969, and we aren't able to turn the internet on until 1983. So right away, we're talking about 14 years of work. And then when the internet turns on in 83, we don't see the World Wide Web showing up until 1993 with the Mosaic browser really opening things up. And then mobile phones and smartphones don't show up until 2007, which is another 14 years later. Another project, which I've been working on since 1998, is an interplanetary extension of the internet in order to support manned and robotic space exploration. And that really starts in earnest in 1998. So it's now nearly 25 years later, and we're at the point where we can launch literally this capability. The system is on board the Artemis mission, which got scrubbed on yesterday. but we hope we'll launch on Friday. But that's taken almost 25 years to get to the point where we can actually have something operating. So passion for me is a very long-lasting kind of mission, and it's one that drives me forward. I mean, I wouldn't do this if I weren't passionate about finding the answers to questions.
So passion is what keeps you going and drives you. Mhm. Solving
Yes,
problems.
it's the determination to get it to work, which is what engineering is all about.
Mhm. So what do you do for fun?
Well, I'm an avid science fiction reader. I collect and consume wine. We have a nice big wine cellar in our home, which is always wonderful when we have guests because if somebody says, well, I really like this very much, I can say, okay, no problem. Let's go down in the wine cellar and find something else. So I enjoy that. Gourmet cooking, not as often as I would like, but from time to time. My wife is better at it than I am, but I'm happy to, play second fiddle and slice up all the vegetables to try to be helpful. I'm an avid reader of not just science fiction, but fiction of nonfiction books, biographies, and history, and things like that. I'm particularly interested in the evolution of society. I mean, how do our institutions grow from our agrarian and even earlier hunter-gatherer period to, how do societies emerge? How do they collapse, which is another interesting phenomenon. They don't all last forever. So I'm a great student of history as well.
So I've got to ask you, white or red? What's your favorite?
Well, I have favorites in both types. There's rosé in between, and although some people sort of poo-poo that, it's really just red wine, which the skins have been taken away from the barrel earlier than otherwise. So on the white side, my favorites come out of Burgundy, from French Burgundy region. And on the red side, it's a little harder because we have many favorites from different parts of the world. So if it's Cabernets, for example, we're pretty heavily invested in the Napa Valley and some of the other um, wine regions in California. For Pinot Noir, I certainly am a big fan of the Oregon Willamette Valley or New Zealand, for example. Have wonderful Pinot Noirs. Shiraz you can find in New Zealand, but especially Australia. And if you want a big, heavy duty, honking big and spicy wine, Shiraz is hard to beat. And then we're big fans of some of the wines in Italy and in Spain, especially in the Catalonia region. So we're very eclectic about our wine tastes. And of course, it's always a big adventure to discover wines, from so many different regions and so many different grape varietals. I mean, there are literally, I suspect, hundreds, if not thousands, of varieties of grape, uh, although most people are familiar with only a handful.
My husband and I moved upstate New York, which is known, of course, for the wineries. So we've been really enjoying going through the Finger Lakes wineries and discovering so many different flavors. It's just been amazing for us. Yeah.
So I have a little story to tell you about that because one of my young winemaker friends made me some wine from grapes that he had in Placerville, which is near Sacramento in California. Apparently, Placerville has been raising grapes and making wine for over 40 years. But he decided because of the fires in California that he would move to Long Island, New York to make wine there because he was concerned that the fires would really destroy the good flavor of the grapes in California. So he moved to Long Island and he's making wine there, which is, sort of consistent with your experience.
Wow, we have to check that out. That's fascinating. I wonder if, the soil is so different there from growing it in California. I wonder if, how the quality of the grapes have changed from moving it from one location to another. That'd be fascinating to find out.
Well, keep in mind that the grapes in New York preceded the grapes in California. California's wine industry starts somewhere around the 1848 period during the gold rush. And so there were a few vineyards there, but I can tell you the New York winemaking business has been around for 400 years.
In fact, we visited one of the third oldest vineyards, which is very close to our house. Is the Oneida Vineyard, and that was amazing. We got to see I think it was, I can't remember, 400-year-old barrels. They made all the wine for the churches. And then when COVID hit, the business literally collapsed because the churches were no longer making communion wine.
Wow.
I know. They went from a multi-million-dollar business literally overnight vanished. So that was
Well,
interesting visiting
you know,
that.
some of the winemakers during the COVID period converted over to making alcohol. So people could, make alcohol hand rub in order to sanitize things.
Okay, so wrapping up this amazing interview, if you had somebody who was deaf, hard of hearing, come up to you and say, Vince, you've had this amazing life, I'm deaf, I'm hard of hearing, and I have this big dream, but I don't think I can do it. What would you tell them?
I would tell them that the whole idea here is not just to try to overcome the problem on your own necessarily. Whenever people want to do something big, I tell them get help, especially from people who are smarter than you are. And so you have to learn to be comfortable with that particular disability, and you need to tell people. You have to be comfortable telling people this is what you need to do in order to communicate with me or to be an effective partner. You have to get comfortable with that. Not everyone is. They worry that somehow they'll be dismissed as incapable of doing anything. But don't let other people define your life for you. That's your job, not theirs.
Yeah, that's beautiful. Don't let other people define your life for you. I love that. I actually have one more question because I'm really personally curious. If you had to name three nonfiction books for self-help or self-growth, what would you recommend?
Oh, that's so hard to answer. Not because I have a long list. Well, no, the problem is that I don't have a long list. And the reason I don't have a long list is that I often don't turn to self-help books necessarily because they're also often self-serving. Some like the book that says how to make $1 million, and of course inside the book it says write a book called How to Make $1 Million and then sell it to everybody else. So to be frank, it's not books that have helped me; it's people that have been examples to me of coping with a disability. The one thing that you can be sure of is that if you're looking for creativity, you'll find a lot of it in people who have disabilities because every day they have to figure out how to overcome those problems or cope with them in some effective way. And that takes a lot of innovation and creativity. So it's really people and their willingness to work with you to overcome some of these challenges that really makes the big difference.
Is there a certain person that comes to mind when you think about that? Someone who mentored you or influenced you?
No, not really. And well, not for this disability. I never really had special mentorship or anything along those lines, but that's because I had hearing aids and I was functioning more or less okay. I had people um, who were comfortable adapting to whatever I needed. And so, get my attention, make sure that I'm seeing them face to face, make sure there's good lighting, make sure the rooms are quiet. We go to a restaurant, get a private room, or have parties that are small enough that there isn't too much noise. And so it's the accommodation of others that has really made my life easier. And I'm very gratified that people are willing to go out of their way to be helpful.
I actually have one more. This is definitely the last one, but I want you to think back. I mean, in your long life, is there a profound life lesson that you can leave us with?
Well, I think the most important one I already mentioned, and it should be a T-shirt, which says, "If you want to do something big, get help." And
Big
you know,
that help.
Yeah, don't be afraid to ask for help or to try to sell your ideas to get other people to want to do what you want to do. Because invariably doing anything big requires more than just one person to make it happen.
It's a beautiful way to wrap up. Thank you so much for your time on this and sharing.
Well, I enjoyed the chat, Karen. I look forward to having another opportunity to just compare notes when we get the chance.
Sounds great. Thank you.